I grew up as the odd kid in my school, not really because of anything I did, but because my family lived far from town. I used to think it was just how things were, but as I got older, I realized my family lived more like survivalists or what you'd call off-the-grid types. They weren't extreme, didn't have a stockpile of weapons or anything, but they enjoyed self-sufficiency and wanted to live on their own terms. They bought a piece of land tucked between a forested valley and a mountain, around 20 acres or so, and the whole place was a good 30 minutes away from the nearest town. While not the most remote setup, it was pretty rugged and very secluded. We didn't have neighbors for at least 25 miles. The kids at school used to call me Amish, which I didn't understand at the time, but looking back, it was actually fitting. My mom loved gardening, and my dad was into woodworking. They both shared a passion for animals and the outdoors, so naturally we had chickens, pigs, and even a goat. We grew our own vegetables and herbs, and we had some fruit trees too. At certain times of the year, life felt incredibly peaceful, but as a kid, I just thought of it as normal. This story takes place one summer after I finished 3rd grade, when I was around 9 years old. My parents had big plans for that summer, and they got me involved in some landscaping projects around the property. The idea was to build a small greenhouse in a clearing near the house, as well as some raised garden beds. We also needed to clear out some brush and fallen branches in another part of the yard. My job was mostly clearing debris and moving materials like bricks and wood planks. I worked hard because I wanted to finish quickly so I could ride my bike or shoot my BB gun. More typical kid stuff. I had a few friends in town I could visit or invite over, so not all the kids thought I was strange. Some even came for sleepovers. But it wasn't lost on me that people thought it was unusual that I literally came out of the woods to catch the school bus every day. The bus had to make a special detour just to pick me up. Public school. It was the 2nd week of summer when we finished the greenhouse and started clearing an area for the garden beds. There was a lot of fallen branches to remove, along with cutting back low bushes using a machete or hatchet. After clearing everything out, we were left with bare dirt. Then we had to pick out all the rocks so we could till the ground and mix in soil and peat moss. I vaguely remember my parents putting a large bucket in the middle of the cleared area and telling me they'd give me a nickel for every stone I tossed into it, or $10 if I could fill it up. I worked hard the first day, filling the bucket twice and earning $20, but I was going at such a fast pace that I burned out. By the 2nd day, I barely filled the bucket once, and on the 3rd day, I was so sluggish that I spent more time gazing at the distant woods and mountain ridges than working. There were always interesting animals to spot: deer, birds, and sometimes a fox. That's when I first noticed something strange. At the edge of our property, I saw a figure moving around. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other wild animal, but I kept seeing it, day after day. It stayed at a distance, but it was always upright. Hidden among the trees and shadows, it looked like a trick of the light, almost as if it wasn't there at all. I tried to ignore it, but one day, it moved in a way that was unmistakable. A long, skinny leg stepped sideways, followed by a lurching movement. Now that I'd seen it move, I realized it wasn't just an illusion. It was a person, a man in ragged clothes, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through me. He never approached us, never made a sound, but he watched us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hadn't realized until that moment that he had been watching me for days. Who was this man and what was he doing out there? We lived miles from the nearest town, so there was no way someone would accidentally wander onto our land. There were campgrounds and hiking trails nearby, but none of them led directly to our property. By the 4th day, I finally told my dad, "Dad, there's someone out there watching us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just a hiker or someone who's lost," he replied calmly. "When did you see him?" I told him it had been the last 3 days. His face shifted slightly, and I knew he was paying attention now. "Is he walking around? Or just standing there?" Dad asked. "He just stands there watching," I said. Dad told me to show him, so I led him out to the spot where I'd been working and pointed to where I'd seen the man. It was getting dark, and of course, the man wasn't there anymore. I described what he was wearing and how he moved. I don't see anything, but it's a long way off. Maybe your eyes were playing tricks on you, Dad said, ruffling my hair and leading me back to the house. He reassured me that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. There was something about that man that unsettled me deeply, like a fear that was slowly creeping in. I finished clearing the field by the 6th day, but every time I looked up, I half expected to see that man standing there, just watching. Then, one afternoon, I saw him again, clearer than ever before. He was right at the edge of the woods, standing still, as if waiting for something. I was about to run when I heard my dad call from behind, "Lunch is ready, son." I didn't turn around, just pointed toward the woods where the man stood. My dad walked up beside me and saw him too, but the moment he did, the man vanished back into the trees. Dad gave me my lunch and took me back to the house, where he and my mom had a quiet, serious conversation. Soon after, Dad grabbed his rifle and some supplies and headed out into the woods. He said he was just going to check things out, but I could tell he was worried. I stood next to my mom, watching as he disappeared into the trees. He was gone for hours, and when he finally came back, he looked pale and shaken. "What did you find out there?" my mom asked, her voice full of concern. Dad hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I found a body, probably a lost hiker. He must have gotten disoriented and didn't make it." Chills ran down my spine. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents always shielded me from stuff like this, but now everything was out in the open. I felt guilty for even telling my dad about the man. What if this was connected? The police were called and they came to retrieve the body. They concluded that the hiker had died from exposure, no foul play. His family had reported him missing months ago, and it seemed like he had gotten lost while hiking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man I'd seen wasn't a lost hiker. There was something much darker about him. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside my window. I froze. When I looked, there he was, the man standing just outside, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He smiled at me, revealing crooked, decayed teeth. I screamed, and my parents rushed into the room. But when they looked outside, there was no one there. No footprints, no sign anyone had been near. Dad tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just the moonlight playing tricks, but I knew what I had seen. After that night, I never saw the man again, but the memory of him still lingers, a shadow in the back of my mind. The investigation into the hiker's death turned up nothing unusual, but part of me will always wonder, who was that man? Really? And why was he watching me? I've always been a wanderer at heart, a traveling musician. Over the years, I've journeyed across the country, performing in grimy bars, tiny cafes, and even on street corners. My old RV, Carla, has been my home for nearly 25 years. Outfitted with solar panels, a small generator, and a basic recording setup, Carla has allowed me to live off the grid, free from the constraints of a regular job. This way of life has been my dream since I was young. I always envisioned myself on a small patch of land, far from the chaos of city life, tending to animals like chickens, pigs, maybe even a goat or two. Though I never got that land, I did get the RV, and I've been living the dream since then. My music is a mix of folk, blues, and country, resonating with those who listen. Over time, I've built a small, loyal following scattered across the nation. But life on the road can get lonely, which is why I love busking. It gives me a chance to connect with strangers, even if just for a moment. There's something magical about seeing someone's expression change because of a song I play. I traded in my dream of farm life for a musician's path. You won't find my albums in stores, but I've been featured on a few recordings, and once people hear my songs, they remember them. As I drive from coast to coast, a sense of freedom always washes over me. Endless skies, open roads, and the hum of Carla's engine as my constant companions. I never have a fixed destination, just the idea of reaching the West Coast before winter. Most days blur together in a rhythm of music, coffee, and cheap roadside snacks, though I do treat myself to better meals occasionally. But the road can be unpredictable, and not every encounter is pleasant. I'm not here to tell you about the good times, though. This is about something darker, something that's only happened once. Living in an RV means I often camp in remote areas, sometimes going days without seeing another person. I had been driving for hours when I found a secluded spot off the highway. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the trees. I parked Carla, set up camp, and cooked a simple dinner of chicken and beans. As the night deepened, I picked up my guitar and started playing softly to the quiet night. It's one of my favorite things, playing music just for myself with no one around to hear. But that night, the silence around me seemed to shift. The trees seemed to stretch taller, the darkness deepened, and even the crickets fell silent. My camp was tucked far from the road, hidden by trees, but through a small break in the forest, I noticed what looked like another campfire in the distance. At first, I thought it might be other travelers. As I kept playing, two figures emerged from the woods, slowly making their way toward my camp. I greeted them with a smile, offering them coffee and a seat by the fire. They looked rough, dressed in old clothes and smelling of sweat and smoke. I figured they were just fellow travelers drawn to the music. Their names escape me now, but let's call them Tom and Greg. They said they were from a nearby state, traveling through for some seasonal work. We exchanged stories, and they asked me to play a few more songs. The evening started off fine, but as the night wore on, I noticed something was off. Their eyes grew sharp, their words slurred, and an unsettling vibe filled the air. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just my nerves. After all, I've met plenty of strangers on the road, and most are harmless. But these guys were different. With each sip of coffee, they seemed to change. Their movements became jerky, and their eyes glinted with something feral. I asked if they were okay, and they mumbled some nonsense. That's when it hit me, these guys were on something and it wasn't good. Feeling the tension rise, I stopped playing and just watched them. Tom started circling my RV, eyeing it with a strange intensity. "You've got some nice stuff here," he said, his voice dripping with something that made my skin crawl. I told them about my RV, how it had a unique ignition system and that no one could steal it unless they knew the code. I figured if they had bad intentions, that would throw them off, but it only seemed to irritate them. Their faces twisted with frustration, and I realized they weren't just looking for a friendly chat. They were scouting me out. The moment I understood their intentions, I grabbed my guitar and slipped into the RV, locking the door behind me. They started banging on the windows, yelling at me. My heart was racing as I fumbled with the keys, but soon enough, Carla's engine roared to life. I slammed on the gas, speeding away as the men chased after me. As I drove, I saw something in the headlights, a makeshift barrier of branches and rocks, likely set up by those two. They had planned this. I backed up quickly and saw them running toward me again. In that instant, I floored it in reverse, aiming straight for them. One of them tripped and fell while the other ran back toward the fire. In the distance, I noticed more people standing in the shadows, a small camp of drifters just waiting. I managed to weave around their barrier and sped back onto the highway. My hands were shaking as I drove toward the nearest town. I finally pulled into a small diner, the neon lights a welcome sight after that terrifying ordeal. The waitress, a kind woman with a warm smile, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She sat me down, brought me a coffee, and asked what had happened. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. I was too shaken. She let me use the phone to call the local police. They went out to check the campsite, but by the time they got there, the drifters were long gone. The officers found my things, including my cooler and a few other items I had left behind in the rush. They said I was lucky. There were signs that those men had been planning something much worse. That night changed me. I realized how fragile my sense of freedom really was. I still love the open road, but now I'm always looking over my shoulder, never taking my safety for granted. We trudged down the dry highway, the hot Arizona sun beating down on our backs. Ryan and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the unknown. We'd been on the road for what felt like forever, weeks, maybe even months. Time blurred when each day was about survival, and our hopes of finding a place to call home seemed to fade with every step. We hadn't started this journey together, but after a few years of rough living, we joined forces. He was from Kentucky, and I hailed from Idaho. We met at a big music festival in Florida. After the festival ended, we were both left with nothing to do and nowhere to go. So we teamed up and decided to travel together. Technically, we were homeless, but we liked to think of ourselves as free spirits. With a few $100s in our pockets and a stash of party drugs, mostly ecstasy and LSD, we filled the gaps between us and people who would never know we existed. The money and drugs ran out fast, and we soon found ourselves stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a pair of cell phones that only worked when we found Wi-Fi. We were dreaming of a place to stay, trying to recreate the festival vibe that had brought us together. Eventually, a big truck rumbled by and picked us up, taking us off the highway. That's when we met him. An old, rough-around-the-edges truck driver with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He was nice enough to give us a ride, but it was clear we had nothing in common with him. Covered in tattoos and sporting a tough guy attitude, it was surprising he stopped at all, but we kept our thanks brief and stayed quiet. He started asking questions, which led to a conversation about where we were headed. "You're not thinking of going to Camp Freedom, are you?" he snorted, referring to the rumored off-the-grid community. "That place is a mess. A bunch of freeloaders living like anarchists, thinking they're above the law." He went on, clearly disapproving, but something in his tone hinted at curiosity, like a part of him was intrigued by the very thing he criticized. When we asked for directions, he scribbled a rough map on a napkin and tossed it into my lap. "Be careful, kids," he warned. "That place isn't for everyone. There's something strange about it." We thanked him and continued on. As we rolled into a nearby town, he dropped us off, wished us luck, and drove away. With the rough directions he gave us, we grabbed some supplies, water, and cigarettes from a gas station and started walking north. The directions were simple enough. When we saw the lake, we were supposed to turn right and head northeast. We eventually caught another ride with a local woman who had never even heard of the place we were headed to, but she dropped us off near the lake. We continued on foot as the sun began to set, and soon we crested a hill to see Camp Freedom spread out before us. The place looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Broken down buildings, rusted RVs, and makeshift shacks surrounded by barbed wire and junk. A hand-painted sign swayed in the wind, "Camp Freedom, the last free place on Earth." It was chaotic but strangely beautiful, true freedom, at least from what I could see. Ryan and I practically ran into the town, passing by campsites scattered across the area. But as we moved deeper into the settlement, something felt off. The air was thick with an eerie stillness. The people, if you could call them that, moved with an odd, animal-like grace, their eyes shining with secrets they clearly weren't willing to share. A man waved us over from one of the shacks. We were relieved to finally meet someone, and we smiled as we approached. "Hey there," I greeted him. "First time here?" the man asked. "Yeah, we just got here. This place is amazing, like something out of a dream," Ryan said. "You got that right," the man replied. "Have you registered with the census yet?" Ryan and I exchanged glances. "No, how do we do that?" Ryan asked. "Follow me," the man said confidently, leading us back the way we had come. We walked for a while, chatting as we went. He introduced himself as Jack and said he worked with the census, helping run the place. It all sounded official, and we bought into it easily. We were just two drifters looking for a place to belong, hoping to be part of something bigger without the grind of normal life. How naive we were. Jack led us to a cluster of rundown shacks, far from the main part of the camp. My stomach twisted with unease as the settlement disappeared from view, hidden behind a hill. Suddenly, gunfire erupted, the sound echoing off the walls like a cruel welcome. We froze, raising our hands in fear as a group of armed people emerged from the shadows. Their faces were hard, a mix of curiosity and hostility. "Who are you?" one of them growled, aiming a gun at us. "They thought they could just stroll into town," Jack sneered, joining their ranks. He had led us straight into a trap. The trucker's warning from earlier rang in my ears. We tried to explain ourselves, but our words were met with suspicion. Dragged before a group of community leaders, we were bombarded with questions. Intense, paranoid accusations that grew more terrifying as the hours passed. It was clear this place wasn't just a laid-back commune. It was a twisted, dangerous outpost where reality and delusion blurred together. Days bled into one another as we were held captive, questioned endlessly, and deprived of food and water. These people weren't part of Camp Freedom at all. They were an outcast group, likely thrown out for being too unhinged, living on the fringes of society and preying on newcomers. Eventually, without warning, they let us go. We stumbled back into the sunlight, dazed and weak. We didn't care about anything except that we were free. But as we made our way back to town, we couldn't shake the feeling that we had left something behind. A piece of ourselves, or maybe something darker. The locals took us in, and we told them about our ordeal. A group of them went out to investigate, but when they returned, they said there was nothing there, just ashes where the shacks had been. It was clear as day to us, though. Smoke still rose in the distance. That was the worst experience of my life, but it also changed me for the better. Ryan stayed behind in Camp Freedom, even got a new name, but I couldn't stay any longer. After a week of recovery, I left, heading back to my hometown in Idaho. I got clean and realized that the road life wasn't for me. I still read about Camp Freedom from time to time. People seemed to have positive experiences, living wild and free. But I'll never forget the nightmare I went through, trapped by people who thought they ruled the desert. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.